Chapter 11. Defending Base Camps. Although guerrilla forces would like to retain the initiative and never have to defend, there are times when the guerrilla force must defend. The guerrilla can conduct a mobile defense or a positional defense. Guerrilla mobile defenses are usually rear-guard actions designed to preserve the main force or draw the attacker into a prepared ambush. Guerrilla positional defenses are normally associated with the defense of a pass, bridge, populated area, base camp, or supply depot. The odds are stacked against the defending guerrilla. The attacker has the initiative, armored vehicles, air power, the preponderance of artillery, and overwhelming firepower. The guerrilla tries to match this through use of terrain and prepared defenses. In the Soviet-Afghan War, the Mujahideen spent a great deal of time and energy in the defense. Mujahideen defense was associated with Mujahideen logistics. Early in the war, Mujahideen logistics requirements were primarily concerned with ammunition resupply and medical evacuation of the wounded. The rural population willingly provided food and shelter to the Mujahideen, since the Mujahideen were mostly local residents. The Soviets decided to attack Mujahideen logistics by forcing the rural population off of their farms into refugee camps in Pakistan or Iran or into the cities of Afghanistan. They did this by bombing and attacking villages, scattering mines across the countryside, destroying crops, killing livestock, poisoning wells, and destroying irrigation systems. The Mujahideen, accustomed to living off the goodwill of the rural population, were now forced to transport rations as well as ammunition from Pakistan and Iran into Afghanistan. The Mujahideen created a series of supply depots and forward supply points to provision their forces. These depots and supply points had to be defended. The Mujahideen also controlled key passes, which forced the Soviets and DRA to either withdraw cut-off forces or resupply them by air. The Mujahideen defended these key passes zealously. The rugged terrain of Afghanistan aided Mujahideen defenses. Defensive positions were another key component of the Mujahideen defense. Mujahideen built rugged, roofed bunkers which could withstand artillery and airstrikes. The Mujahideen built elaborate camouflage defensive shelters and fighting positions connected with interlocking fields of fire, communications trenches, and redundant firing positions. The Mujahideen learned to rotate defensive forces through a position to lessen the effects of combat fatigue and psychological stress. What follows are examples of successful and unsuccessful Mujahideen base camp defenses against ground attack or a combination of ground and air assault. Vignette 1. Soviet Offensive through Sirk Rud by Commander Mohammad Asif. During 1978 to 1979, the heavy populated Sirk Rud district was a hotbed of resistance against the communist regime and a base for Mujahideen actions in the Nangarhar province. Following the Soviet invasion, one of the early major Soviet operations was conducted against Mujahideen bases in Sirk Rud. There are two main roads running northeast to southwest in Sirk Rud Valley, map 11-1, Shaharbagh. Highway 134 runs through Shaharbagh, Watapur, Sirk Rud, the district headquarters, Khairabad, and Fatabad. The other road runs along the bottom of Torgar Mountain. It passes through Darunta, Katapur, Balaba, and then follows the Sirk Rud River to the west. Most of the Mujahideen bases were located along these two roads, and most Mujahideen bases also maintained hideouts in the canyons of the Torgar Mountain. My hometown of Bazet Kel was located between the two roads, but my base was just to the east of Highway 134. The Soviet forces concentrated in Jalalabad in May 1980. We were tipped off that the Soviets planned to advance along the two roads, destroying Mujahideen bases as they went. Their southern column would swing north at Fatabad to seal the pocket. I left my base at Shaharbagh and went to my village at Bazet Kel, where I had 80 men. I took 50 of these men north into a Torgar Mountain canyon. We intended to stop the Soviet column on the northern route before they reached the main Mujahideen base at Katapur. We also hoped to buy enough time to allow the civilians to escape into the mountains. When the column approached, my force engaged them, and we stopped the column. The Soviets dismounted and began moving aggressively into the mountains. They were a bit too aggressive, and our fire cut them down. The Soviets were badly bloodied. The Soviets responded by calling in massive artillery fire on my positions. When night fell, I pulled my force further up the canyon to the mountain ridge and then crossed over into the next canyon to the west. We moved down the canyon and into the town of Khatapur. At Khatapur, the local Mujahideen told us that Soviet troops had chased the civilians into the mountains just north of Khatapur and killed many of them. During the fighting near Khatapur, the Soviets had left 2 of their dead behind. The Mujahideen expected that the Soviets would return for their dead. My Mujahideen joined other Mujahideen, and we went to defend a canyon to the north of Khatapur. We laid an ambush on the high ground. Soon, a Soviet detachment appeared looking for their dead. We opened up on the Soviets, and they left 7 more dead behind. However, they retaliated on the villagers and massacred civilians and even animals in Balaba and Khatapur, and then moved on to Fatehbad. The Soviets could not dislodge the Mujahideen from the mountains and could not find us in the valley, so they killed everything in sight. They established 3 bases, at Balaba, Fatehbad, and Sultanpur. The Soviets launched search-and-destroy missions from these bases against the adjacent villages. Many civilians had to flee west while Mujahideen detachments went to their hideouts in the Torgar mountain. Mujahideen commanders calculate that the Soviets massacred some 1,800 people during 12 days in the Sirk Rud. Most of these were innocent civilians. The Soviets expected that they could readily flush out the Mujahideen. Their lack of success led to frustration, and the Soviet soldiers ran amok, killing and looting. It was the first Soviet operation in the area. They came looking for U.S. and Chinese mercenaries, and instead found frustration and an opportunity to murder and loot. Commentary. During this stage of the war, the Mujahideen lived in their own houses in the midst of the population. Their food, water, and shelter was willingly supplied by the populace. As a result, many civilians died when the Soviets launched their operation. The large number of reported civilian deaths could be a result of lack of officers' control and unit discipline or deliberate policy. The apparent Soviet plan was to separate the guerrilla from the populace by forcing the populace out of the countryside. Later, most of the populace deserted their homes in this area and fled to refugee camps in Pakistan. This is too large an area to block and sweep as a single action, and the Soviets failed to segment the area and clear it a piece at a time. This allowed many of the Mujahideen and civilians to escape the cordon. The Soviet emphasis on the primacy of the large operation instead of the well-executed tactical action worked to the Mujahideen advantage. Mujahideen command and control was fragmented and worked through happenstance and chance encounters. Without advanced warning, the Mujahideen would probably have suffered much more in this sweep. Vignette 2. Defending Sirkab Base Camp by Haji Syed Mohammed Hanif. In 1980, the Mujahideen began establishing bases in the mountains near the village of Sirkab in Logar province. There were perhaps 150 Mujahideen in the area belonging to several factions. Malawi Mohammed Yusuf of the ANLF, Malawi Mohammadeen of the IRMA, and small groups from JIA and IUA established bases there. My base was in the mountains east of Sirkab in a canyon called Duro. We had 82mm mortars, Dishkas, and RPG-7s. Early in the morning of the 5th of June 1980, a mixed DRA Soviet column came from Kabul and exited Highway 157 at Puli, Kandahari, heading east. They were coming for us. They deployed their artillery and began shelling our base. Most of the Mujahideen were in their villages at that time. They came out of their villages and occupied defensive positions while other Mujahideen joined them from their mountain bases. In order to block the advance of the enemy into our mountain bases, we occupied blocking positions at Spingar Mountain overlooking Dara Village, map 11-2, Sirkab. Other Mujahideen occupied positions south of Duro Canyon and Lakegar Mountain. Our original plan was to defend the forward slopes of Spingar and Lakay Gar. We set an ambush forward of our main defenses. It inflicted casualties, but was eventually overwhelmed. After their artillery preparation, enemy tanks and infantry moved along the valley road from Korek and attacked Mujahideen positions at the canyon's western mouth. Fighting was heavy. This was our first experience fighting the Soviets. Their helicopters came in to evacuate their dead and wounded. Our civilians suffered horribly. The people began leaving their homes and fleeing to the mountains. Fighting continued all day long, but the enemy was unable to break through the Mujahideen positions. On the second day, there were fewer Mujahideen fighting as some had left the area overnight. The enemy kept firing tremendous pressure on the remaining Mujahideen, and many had to withdraw from their fighting positions. There is a covered approach to Spingar Mountain from the north using the Tobagi Plain. The plain is higher than Surkab village, and it is easier to climb Spingar Mountain from the Tobagi Plain than from the Surkab Valley. I was climbing the mountain with two others carrying ammunition. I intended to climb over the mountain to the north face. As we reached halfway up the ridge, enemy aircraft flew over the area. The enemy usually marked their infantry positions for the aircraft by firing smoke or signal rockets. We saw rockets being fired on the other side of the mountain. This meant that enemy infantry were on the other side of the mountain and were trying to encircle the Mujahideen bases by a flanking movement from the Tobagi Plain. I had all our spare ammunition with me, and at that time ammunition was as precious to me as my faith. We climbed back down the mountain and saw that the other Mujahideen were retreating into their bases. The people of Surkab came to the Mujahideen and demanded that we move our bases lest Surkab be invaded every day. The mullahs had refused to move the bases earlier, but now they were panicked and hiding in caves. The people taunted them with, "You told us this was jihad, but now you are trying to flee." Some of the mullahs came out, but everyone was still panicked. I had all of this ammunition and no one to help me move it. I thought of abandoning the ammunition and saving my skin, but then I thought how vital the ammunition was and what would happen if I was later called to account for my actions. Finally, a group of us decided to make a suicidal last stand and called for volunteers. Lieutenant Sharab, a DRA deserter, volunteered. We had suspected him earlier, but he proved himself now. Lieutenant Sharab said, "They are not used to mountains. It will take them a long time to climb them, and they are afraid of these mountains. If you fire at them from one position, they will stop and return fire for a long time at that position." We fired mortars at the north slope and positioned some Mujahideen on the top of Spingar Mountain to draw fire. This was the turning point. All of a sudden, helicopter activity fell off and firing tapered off in the valley. We thought that it was a trick to make us believe that the fighting was over so the Mujahideen would come out of their hideouts and then they would take us from behind. We did not expect that such a powerful enemy would abandon an almost certain victory and retire empty-handed. It was late afternoon when I saw civilians coming from Surkab. They told us that the enemy had withdrawn. The enemy evidently didn't want to have to fight to take the mountain. This was not our doing, but the hand of God. We lost 10 KIA and 6 WIA in my group. I do not know the casualties in other groups. All the wounded who could walked to Pakistan for treatment. The other wounded were treated by local doctors. Doctors from Kabul hospitals would come to help us also. Dr. Abdur Rahman from a hospital in Kabul would often treat our wounded. I do not know what the enemy losses were, but they must have suffered a lot to quit on the brink of victory. Commentary. The DRA Soviets had the opportunity to attack the eastern and western canyon mouths simultaneously. The Mujahideen defenses were oriented to the west. Even on the second day, when the DRA Soviets tried to envelop the Mujahideen position from the Tobagi Plain, they did not hook around the mountain, but tried to go over the mountain. The Mujahideen were used to the mountains, whereas the Soviets were not, and their equipment was not designed for climbing in mountains. Later in the war, the Soviets issued better equipment for fighting in the mountains and began training their soldiers at mountain warfare sites. At this point, the non-nimble Soviets and the reluctant DRA were no match for the Mujahideen in mountain maneuver. They should have taken the canyon from both ends. Further, if the DRA or Soviets had covertly moved some artillery spotters onto high ground before the offensive, They could have unhinged the Mujahideen defenses before they were established. The Soviets had not yet developed their air assault tactics for counterinsurgency. The mountaintops of Spin Gar and Lake Gar can handle heliborne landings, and the Mujahideen air defense posture was negligible at this point. A small Soviet force, reinforced with mortars, artillery spotters, and forward air controllers and machine guns, could have created havoc from the mountain tops.